Well, good evening. It's nice to be back, especially since I died in 1958. And of course, a lot of people who go through that death experience don't get the opportunity to return. But when I had the invitation to come here and talk to you about my days here at Cheyenne, growing up in Colorado Springs in the early part of this century, my life at Colorado College and at Colorado Springs High School, my part in the rejuvenation of square dancing and round dancing here in the United States, why I couldn't pass up the opportunity. And I see from a few of you here that maybe knew me when I was here that I never missed an opportunity to give a talk. And I'm especially thrilled to be with people who love dancing, music, drama, Shakespeare, these hills and mountains and the paintings that are still here in the library. And what I'd like to do is spend a little bit of time talking to you about my early life my life in the early part of this century. And I think it's fitting that as you are coming to the end of the 20th century, it's nice to find out something about what it was like in the early part of it. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. I was born on September 29th, 1890, and Benjamin Harrison was president of the United States. The population of the country was around 75 to 80 million, and certainly Colorado's population at that time was similar to Wyoming today. My mother was Julia Banker Shaw. She was born in Ohio. And my father was William G. Shaw. He was born in England. He came to this country when he was 2 years old with his family. And my mother and father met in Topeka, Kansas. They were married there. They moved to Denver. And I was born there in Denver, as were my two older brothers, Ray and Glenn. I did move for a couple years. My family moved to California, to Los Angeles, and I bring this up just because it's a rather interesting little tidbit. My father had a job working on houses in Los Angeles. Now, believe me, in the early 1890s, building a house was not what development is today. If you had a saw and a hammer and a shovel, you could go into business. But they were building some homes in a place near Los Angeles, and they were asked, they decided they had to name this place, and there were some beautiful holly trees there, so they called it Hollywood. Well, I'm sure my father never realized the notoriety that would come from that particular place. In 1893, there was a severe financial crisis in this country, and it was based on the gold and silver standard. As a result, my father lost his job. The family did not have the resources to just start something new. Fortunately, we were able to move back to Denver with the help of my uncle, my father's older brother. He went into business operating a small grocery store near Denver East High School. Now, I have to say that at the time I was born, I was not using a cane. That came later. And also, I did not wear a cowboy hat at that time, but I had to get a job when I was a young boy in Denver, and so I started selling the Saturday Evening Post. And I remember walking around City Park and the lake there, and I recall at the end of the 19th century, the wonderful attire of people there at that time, the top hats and the carriages and horses and so forth. I would then go down 17th Street to Union Station, and those streets of Winecoop and Market and Larimer were just bustling with activity. People, horse traders, cattle traders, people in the mining business. And certainly, it was a wonderful place to sell the Saturday Evening Post because virtually everyone who came into Denver came by way of railroad. In 1902, our family moved from Denver here to Colorado Springs. And we purchased a house in the 1300 block of North Weber. I started into Garfield School at that time, and something happened the very month that I started at Garfield that I didn't realize the significance of it till later on, and that is that 12 blocks south of where we were living on Weber Street, on September 14th of that year, Winfield Scott Stratton died. Now, he was the first millionaire to come out of Cripple Creek and had an enormous influence on this city, still does. And he was an interesting philanthropist, an eccentric character, and it wasn't until later on again that I realized his role, but I thought it was always significant that I was starting school just 12 blocks from where he had died on Weber. The first year I was at Garfield in the fall there, something happened that still carries on to this day, and that is the teacher asked all of us in the class to write a short play. So I wrote a play about what it would be like to be a little wise man in Bethlehem at the time of the Nativity. I don't remember what grade the teacher gave me, and I don't know what comment she had about it, but I thought it was a pretty good play. And of course, those of you realize, again, that I don't suffer from modesty. Well, I put that play away and saved it. A couple years later, then, I entered Colorado Springs Main High School, and that was the only high school here in town. Today, you know it as Palmer High, but it was at the same place at the corner of Platt and Nevada Avenue. The principal of the school was a man who I admired a great deal, and I didn't realize his influence on me till later on, because he was a role model for a position I would have as principal of a school. In high school, I came to understand a lot of who I was, what I liked. I loved to hike and climb and be in the mountains. I played on the football team. I read, loved Shakespeare and English and literature. I was on the debate team, and I was in the Oratorical Society. And there were a couple things that I remember from high school that had a real influence on me. One, at the end of my sophomore year, I got a job as a busboy at the old Broadmoor Casino up here on the hill, and this is before the hotel was built. And like busboys, I'm sure that are still working today, I cleaned tables and all this, but I saved my money. And at the end of the summer, I noticed in the paper that there was going to be an auction. And among the things being auctioned off were books. And I thought, well, this is a chance for me to develop my library. So I came into this room with all these things being auctioned off, and I looked up, and there was a 40-volume set of all of Shakespeare's works. And I decided, I'm going to get it. Well, fortunately, there was no rich person there bidding against me, and at the end of the day, I went home with that whole set of Shakespeare's works. And it was one of the best things I ever did in my life. His work, his thought, got into me, into my bones and my fiber. And there may even be some of you here today who remember times when I was standing on a table in the library of the old Cheyenne school reciting Hamlet to the consternation of my wife. Also in high school, I was on the Oratorical Society. My junior year, I was selected as the top orator here in Colorado Springs, and I went to the state meet on it. An interesting thing happened. There were 3 judges. 2 of them selected me as the best orator. The 3rd judge picked me for 7th. Well, it was a combined score, so I didn't win. Fortunately, the following year as a senior, I went back, I gave the same talk, and then I was selected as the top high school orator in the state of Colorado. I will tell you that that man who selected me as 7th, he died, but he has come back and he's now a figure skating judge. In 1909, I graduated from high school. That was also the year that General Palmer died. In fact, it would be 89 years ago this coming Friday that he died. And what I remember about that is that his funeral and the burial, that was the biggest crowd I had ever seen in my life. There were 4,000 people at that event. Well, that fall, I entered Colorado College, 2 weeks after I had enrolled, I was elected president of my class. And college, in many ways, was a continuation of the interests that I had developed in high school. I continued to hike and climb. I loved theater. I studied English primarily and science. One of the things I remember about college is that I worked during the summers on the short line railroad that went from Colorado Springs up to Cripple Creek. And that was a wonderful experience for me. I came to understand the influence of the gold mining camps on Colorado Springs. It put me into the mountains every day. My job on the railroad was to be a barker. That is, I had told the tourists and everyone what we were seeing, the geology, the trees, the animals, the mountains, and so forth. And also I was a photographer. I would take pictures of people and then hopefully sell them a copy of that picture later on, and if they bought it, then I made some money. But it's very interesting that exactly 100 years ago, in the mid-1890s, Cripple Creek and Colorado Springs were at opposite ends. The major city in this area was Cripple Creek. There were more churches, there were more restaurants, theaters, a wonderful opera house. There were 3 railroads that went in there, the Midland, the Short Line, and then the railroad from the south side from Florence up to Cripple Creek. The city had attracted thousands of people from all over the United States and Europe who came there to make their living, not to make their living, to make their wealth, to strike it rich. The undertaker in Cripple Creek in 1894 was averaging about 1 murder per month that he had to handle. In 1896, it had increased to 2 per week. So it was a sort of rowdy crowd that was living there in Cripple Creek at that time. Of course, as you remember, the city burned down, but they put it back together quickly. There were big fights between labor and management and so forth. The women who came there, I think they came primarily to find a man who had struck it rich. There's a story about a woman who used to come out each day and sit on a bench on Bennett Street. She knew everybody. Always had a bag of popcorn or peanuts, and she fed the chipmunks and squirrels. And one day, this man came down, and he sat down on a bench near her, and she looked at him, and she said, "I've never seen you before. Where have you been?" He said, "I just got out of prison." "Oh. Well, how long were you in prison?" "Oh, I was in prison for 17 years. Well, why were you in prison?" "Well, I shot my wife." And she thought for a moment and said, "So, you're single." The other great event that occurred to me in college was that I met a wonderful woman named Dorothy Stott. She was from Denver. We were in the same class together at Colorado College. We were engaged our junior year. And then in 1913 we graduated. And on September 3rd of that year, we were married here in Colorado Springs, and we spent a wonderful 3-day honeymoon in Palmer Lake. And I look back on my years both at Colorado Springs High School and at Colorado College, and a couple things strike me as somewhat different than the way things are today. If you looked at the yearbook for the year I graduated from high school, 1909, you'd see that there were 20 faculty members. And of those 20 faculty members, 5 taught Latin and Greek. I'm not sure the proportion is the same today. Another man who had a great influence on me was President Slocum at Colorado College. When we were seniors, we could go to his house every Monday night for, well, we called it attic philosophy. I don't remember what he called it, but and essentially it was a course in ethics. And what it did is it put me in touch with a fine thinker, a very talented man, a man whose name is still remembered by all of you at go to Colorado College campus with Slocum Hall. But I learned a lot about the whole process of getting students to think and how he went through that. In 1913, I was teaching at Cutler Academy. Cutler Academy was a prep school that Colorado College operated in order to prepare students for higher studies. The college had started just 3 years after General Palmer founded this city. It was in, I think it was 1873 that this, 3 or 4 that the college started. Had some rough years. 1 or 2 years they even closed down because they simply didn't have any money. But some of the requirements in the early years to go to the school was, one, you had to be able to read Latin, Greek, speak French, German, and have obviously a good understanding of English and English literature. So a lot of students came here and had to go through prep school in order before they could get into the college. Well, I loved teaching at Cutler Academy. I find that the interaction with the students, the research, working in the library and so forth was wonderful. And I knew that's the career I wanted to follow. That was the good news. The bad news was that 5 months after I started there, the trustees of Colorado College voted to close the place. So suddenly, I had to look for a new job. Well, fortunately, a position opened up at Colorado Springs High School for a biology teacher. So in 1914, I began teaching there. I was also working with all the drama productions, and I was the manager of the football team. And I was making $1,060 a year. 2 years later, I heard about a position that opened up at a small country school about 3 miles from downtown Colorado Springs called Cheyenne. So I came out here, and I was interviewed by the board and met with faculty members and so forth. And not until the first week in August did I hear that I had been selected. Well, I was thrilled. I was 25 years old. I was 3 years out of college. I was married to a wonderful woman. I was coming to a school that had 2 things that fit me perfectly. One is that it was a small school where all the grades were in one building. And secondly, we were in a setting that was absolutely beautiful, and I loved the stream and the nature preserve and the mesa to the north, being able to hike up into the canyons and so forth. And in addition, my salary went flying up to $1,600 a year. Well, my first year here at Cheyenne, at Christmas time, the students put on a little production of carols and so forth, and I helped them produce Bird's Christmas Carol. But at the end of the season, I realized this was not exactly what I wanted, so I got out that little play that I had done at Garfield School, and I started working on it, and worked on it for 6 months, and wrote it as simply and as reverently as I could. And in addition, I had the benefit of my wife, Dorothy, who wrote a number of verses for it, and in essence gave a voice to the inner feelings and thoughts of Zara. Well, by the time Christmas came, we had had tryouts, we had got the play together, and finally on Friday, December 21st, 1917, we had the first performance of The Littlest Wise Man. And it went very well. And we looked forward to the coming years when we could do it again. In that following that Christmas, we got more costumes and clothing, actually, from a minister who'd heard about our play and had been over in the Jerusalem area and brought them back. And so it made our play far more authentic. We also improved the music, worked on the staging, and we were looking forward to the play for that year of 1918. However, on October 6th of 1918, our school was closed. It was closed by the health officials because there was a severe epidemic of influenza. 2 days before, a student and also a professor at Colorado College had died, and died very quickly. They got sick, and within 24 hours had died. And this wasn't, I shouldn't even use the word epidemic. It was a pandemic. It was all around the world. Somewhere between 20 and 30, 35 million people died around the world from that influenza. Here in the United States, more people died from that in a 4-month period between the end of September and the end of December than were killed in the First World War, the Second World War, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War combined. In Philadelphia, in the month of October, the death rate from the influenza and so forth was up 700% compared to the year before. And it was a very sad and lonely time here. The schools were closed, all church services were canceled, there were no public meetings, and the only way public health officials could deal with this crisis was simply don't go around other people. So it was a lonely time. The most positive thing that happened that fall was simply that the First World War ended. General Pershing had asked President Woodrow Wilson to send more troops over, and he was caught in a bind because he knew that if he put all these troops on a ship or ships and influenza was there, a lot of those boys would be buried at sea. And yet he did send them over, and fortunately the war ended that November. I also might parenthetically add that I think Woodrow Wilson was the most famous professor that Colorado College has had. He taught there for a semester in the late 1890s. Well, the following year, we got back, we produced The Littlest Wise Man. By 1920, we were doing 10 performances per year. People were coming from Wyoming and Kansas and New Mexico to see it. It had taken hold here in the city. The paper here in the town called it the Little Oberammergau of the Rockies. The students, though, felt that 10 performances were too many. So we cut it back to 10. We also agreed that there would be no charge to see the play. And from that time on until the Christmas of 1950, we did The Littlest Wise Man every year. And I remember those years with the warmest memories. The faculty that participated in it, all the students who helped with the staging, with cutting down vines and so forth and putting them up in the school. And I'm sure that there are still people here today who remember walking those hallways, and the aroma of that pine is still part of you. I also remember the boys who played Zara, starting with the first one was little Mel Weimer. And was the father of the Mel Weimer who most of you have known today, who sadly died this past June. But little Mel played Zara for a few years. He then went on to Northwestern University, got a couple degrees, came back, taught at CC. Don Haney, Bob Bernheim, and the last Littlest Wise Man was Dusty Lou. But I remember all of them very fondly. Another event that was certainly warm for me at Christmas was on the 5 days before we began the Christmas vacation, I would have the junior and senior high come into the auditorium and read to them Dickens' Christmas Carol. And I always enjoyed that, to watch the 7th graders who for the first time heard this masterful tale and about Tiny Tim and Scrooge and so forth. And yet the seniors themselves, hearing it for the 6th time, their eyes still light up at that wonderful story. Dorothy told me years even after we had left the school that she felt that was the most enjoyable and the consistent thing we had at Cheyenne was the participation of the students in The Littlest Wise Man. And I'm thrilled that today that play is still produced, primarily in Fort Worth, Texas by the Walsh family, and they've done it now 38 years in a row. Well, I thought maybe for a moment you could hear what I really sounded like when I was doing The Littlest Wise Man. In the years I've been gone, my voice seems to have not be quite as deep.
Is it to Bethlehem, by way of the seven seas, by Joppa and Jerusalem and the Mount of the Olive Trees? How many leagues by water and land, half of the world's wide space, to where the dull small houses stand beside the marketplace? One takes the sea in a mighty ship, one rides with the caravan, till the dusty palms of Beersheba dip at the edge of the desert stand. And I may not stand in Bethlehem, nor feel the touch of his hand, nor hear the stir of his garment's hem through the dreary little land. How far is it to Bethlehem, maiden mother of all the towns? And must one go by Jerusalem and the gray Judean downs? How far, by way of a man's own heart, dull with the world's old sin? Only as far as one stands apart to let a star shine in.
I'm sure it's difficult today, at the end of the 20th century, to realize how different life was in those years when I was growing up, in my first years here at Cheyenne. We had no computers, no fax machines. The telephone had been invented, but there were very few in private homes. Transportation was quite different. The first year that I remember a student having a car at Colorado College was 1913. And we all thought, why in the world had this family given this boy a car? It had the solid round rubber tires. It got stuck in more places. Guys hurt their shoulder because they were out there cranking it, and then the motor would backfire and throw their shoulder out. And besides, there was a wonderful trolley system here in Colorado Springs. There were horses. You could walk. Going between here and Denver, or traveling around, we always went by railroad. It wasn't until about 1920 was the first time that I drove a car to Denver. It took me 5.5 hours to get there. And even at that time, the entire road was not paved. We had to go around farms and so forth. Although I hear that the way things are going, it may take you 5.5 hours to get to Denver. But the railroads were a dominant industry in this country. If someone had told me at that time that in another 50 years, the majority of people would be traveling long distance by airplane, I wouldn't have believed them. To go to Cripple Creek or Denver or to the east and so forth was always by railroad. The trolley system here in Colorado Springs had started in 1887. And for the first day was on November 2nd of that year, and a trolley went from Castilla Street north on Tejon to Cache La Poudre. And it was a coach pulled by 2 horses. Turned around, went back down. Well, a couple years later, this had increased to, they had 10 coaches and 40 horses. And it had expanded some around the city. Well, as you realize, electricity came along, and by 1890 then, the whole system had been electrified, and the trolleys were then coming out here to the Broadmoor and to the Canyon area, went out to Colorado City and to Manitou. And certainly one of the boons to the trolley system was what General Palmer wanted to do with this city. You know, he wanted it to have it a clean place where morally upright people lived, and in the afternoon would go to the Antlers Hotel and drink tea. And of course there would be no liquor. Well, the astute business people in Colorado City said, here's a chance to make money. By 1895, there were over 30 bars in Colorado City, plenty of gambling houses, I don't know how many brothels. So the people in Colorado Springs that needed adult entertainment could take the trolley over. Well, this helped the trolley system. Then in 1899, Winfield Scott Stratton purchased the trolley system for $350,000 and immediately turned around and put over $2 million into upgrading it and made it one of the finest in this whole country. And that operated until April 14th of 1932, and that was, I think, the last day that a trolley ran in this city. But it was a wonderful way of getting around the town. Part of the appeal of it occurred right up here in Stratton Park, where Cheyenne Boulevard and Cheyenne Road meet. Stratton had built a park. There was a wonderful amphitheater there. He hired the Midland Railroad Band to play there each summer. He had given money so that every year they got $4,000 and put on these free concerts. When I was in college, we would often go out there on a Sunday afternoon and spend our time there, hike up into North Cheyenne Canyon or South Cheyenne Canyon, go up Cheyenne Mountain. There was a Dempsey-Tunney fight held at Stratton Park. In 1916, the first year that I taught school, or that I was principal of the school here, there were a group of men called the $100 Million Club. And that was a club composed supposedly of 100 men, each of whom had $1 million. And they all loved prize fighting, so they set up an arena in the 500 block of West Colorado. Today, as you come across that new bridge that they're just finishing, and under the interstate, there on your right there's a glass company and I think a liquor store and so forth. Well, they built a 10,000-seat arena there for a lightweight world championship fight on September 4th of 1916. Well, everybody got together, but before the fight began, half the stands fell down, 160 people were injured, and 2 people got killed. So it sort of put a damper on those fights. It was also a time when Spencer Penrose came into existence around here, had an enormous influence. He opened the Broadmoor Hotel in June of 1918. He had made what we would consider quite a bit of money in Cripple Creek mining gold, but then invested his money in Kennecott copper. And in 1904, when the older Mr. Tutt died, Mr. Penrose was left as the primary stockholder in Kennecott copper, and he was making $200,000 a month. So when he built the Broadmoor Hotel and spent $2 million on it, it really didn't alter the lifestyle that he and Julie had. He also eventually purchased the highway, or built the highway going up to top of Pikes Peak. He then later on purchased the cog train from A.J. Simmons. Simmons is the mattress man, and he decided to get back into building mattresses and quit trying to run a railroad. And so Julie loved the railroad and encouraged Spencer to invest more money into it, and so it turned out to be a fine investment and still a fine way to get to the top of Pikes Peak. I wanted to mention, too, that one of the nice things about the trolley system here in town was not only that it came right out here by Cheyenne School and along Cheyenne Boulevard, but they had a wonderful safety record. And in all the years that it operated, no one had ever been killed riding on the trolley system in all 40-some years. However, there were 2 employees who were killed. One day, one of the trolleys had gone north on Tejon out to Roswell, and the train was coming back. And there was no passenger on there, just the trainman and the conductor. And 2 guys jumped on the train to rob it. They shot the trainman and got away. Well, the sheriff and people here formed a posse and went out to try and find who'd done this dastardly deed. And they couldn't find the people, these 2 men. However, one man's conscience got the best of him. And he reported himself. They then found the other man. Both of them went to Canyon City. And the man who'd committed the murder, he wasn't in Canyon City too long before they hung him there. In the other case, there was a trolley going south on Tejon, had just come to the underpass where the railroad goes across, and so they'd stopped the trolley. A passenger got on and started this ferocious argument with the conductor, of all things, arguing about religion. Well, the argument became so heated, this man pulled out a gun and shot the conductor. But they never had a trial because his conscience or something got the best of him and he committed suicide. I mentioned to you earlier that General Palmer's desire to have a very clean and neat city and so forth, and I think that a lot of those people who were with him at that time are ones that I subsequently met when I died. After I died, an angel met me and we were walking around, and I heard this group of people wailing and yelling. And I asked the angel, I said, what's going on here? The angel said, these are Baptists who danced. And I was shocked. Well, we went on to another group. We heard another group of people crying for mercy. And I asked the angel, I said, who are these people? And he said, well, these are Catholics who ate meat on Friday. I couldn't believe it. And then we came to a third group. And they were also in great agony and crying for help. And I said, who are these people? The angel said, these are Episcopalians who use the wrong fork. I didn't see General Palmer there, but anyway. Cheyenne School afforded Dorothy and me an opportunity to put into practice an educational system that was different than other public schools. And as I mentioned, we had two wonderful advantages here. One is it was a small school. When I started, there were 9 faculty members. I knew all the students, and the school stayed that way pretty much until the time I retired. The last few years we had to start making some additions, and that certainly influenced me leaving. But for most of the years I was here, 1st through 12th grades were all in one building. The faculty members all knew one another, and there was a certain integrity and cohesiveness that was wonderful. The other advantage, again, was simply the area in which we lived. When I started, this land here south was owned by Stratton Home. And I went to Stratton Home and said, could we build a nature preserve there? And they said, well, if you would keep it as a nature preserve, we'll do that. And that turned out to be a wonderful addition to our school here. We had a theater over there, the creek went through, we built pathways. There were plenty of birds and animals and so forth, and a chance for the students to see the seasons of the year. We took a number of hikes and walks up here on the mesa to the north. In the fall, the first time there was a snowfall, I called off school. We went up with the junior high and the senior high up onto the mesa and spent the day and saw the changing season of the year. We took plenty of ski trips. There were camping trips in the fall and the spring. We had a cabin up in back of Seven Falls that we went to quite often. One year we had a glider, and we used to take the glider up on the mesa there behind an old truck and pull it down. That only went on for 1 year. At the end of the year, a man came to us and said, I'd like to buy that glider and be the first person to fly off the top of Pikes Peak. Well, he paid us some money for it, but it was disastrous for both him and for the glider. We also had a rodeo there 1 year. Also, about 4 or 5 years after I had started as principal of the school, I decided something I wanted to do that had a significant influence on the way the school operated. I mentioned to you that I had played football in both high school and in college, and I liked the sport. I liked the discipline of it, I liked the risk that was involved, and I liked the strategy of the game. After I had coached it here for about 3 or 4 years, I realized that this did not fit in with the educational philosophy that I wanted. So I went to the board, I asked them that we needed to cut out football. Well, a lot of the parents were very upset. Some of them took their boys out of school. They went to Colorado Springs High School. But the board agreed with it, and I stuck with that through all the years I was principal here. And I realize that today, if I was to cut out football from this district or any other, I'd be the first superintendent hung at the corner of Tejon and Pikes Peak Avenue. But at the time, and I believed it afterwards because I wrote a series of articles in which I talked about this, I thought there was too much adulation given to the football players. I did not like the fact that we had a school activity which ruled out more than half the students, first of all the girls, and a lot of the boys who had no inclination or desire to play the game. I also did not like the fact that the students were defining themselves and their school in terms of victory over other schools. I did not think that was the purpose of an education here. I took seriously the idea that a principal of a school is to be the principal teacher. And I taught all the years I was here. If I didn't teach a class in Shakespeare or in Colorado history, I had students come into the auditorium usually 2 or 3 times a week for just 10 or 15 minutes, and I talked to them maybe about one of these paintings we had purchased, maybe about a trip we had taken, maybe about Shakespeare. But this was also written up in 1941 in the Saturday Evening Post about my position on not having a football team. But the activities that we had here at the school, I wanted to have them what my daughter Dolly called an ecological approach. And that is that everything we did fit together. That the activities of going up on top of the building and looking at the stars through a telescope, or going horseback riding up in the canyon, or going to the cabin behind Seven Falls, or going on a ski trip or hiking, fit together with the history, the English, and the mathematics, the science, everything we were doing so that the whole person was educated and that the activities we had were open to all the students. In the 20s, I became interested in European folk dancing. And I found that the students responded very warmly to this. And after about a year, they came to me and said, "We would like to have this done on Wednesday nights. Could you open up the school and we could come and just dance?" Well, I thought that was a good idea. And so not only did the students come and dance, but also faculty members were coming, the parents, members of the community. As time went on, I became more interested in American folk dancing, and particularly American square dancing. And gradually we made a shift away from European-style folk dancing to American square dancing. To my somewhat surprise, we began to be invited to different events. We went to the State Fair one year. We were invited to a convention in Denver. We went up to Central City and performed different types of dances. Well, the long and short of it was that over the years we became known as a school which had the square dance team. And not only a team, but all the students could dance. By the late 30s and then through the 40s, the team would go on a trip each fall and each spring, one time to the East Coast, the other time to the West Coast. And I don't think there's any argument that I became the best square dance caller in the United States. I wrote several books on it. I conducted workshops here during the summer where people came from all around the United States to learn how to dance. One year, I was the caller in the movie Duel in the Sun with Gregory Peck and Jennifer Jones. So it was a wonderful and a sort of a defining activity at this school. And I don't want to imply that absolutely everyone loved it. There were people who did not like it. They didn't like me. They didn't like my style of discipline, and certainly, to put it most charitably, some people said I was a benevolent dictator. But I think in the long and short of it was that it gave the students who went through this school at that time a wonderful educational opportunity, and those who did decide to get on the dance team and were able to make it and go on the trips had an opportunity that hardly any other students around the country had. A woman, Barbara Stock, who still lives here, you know her as Barbara Bradley, talked about being in New York in the late 40s and for the first time seeing television. And then the next day, we were on a show with the original Broadway cast from Oklahoma. And so she was on television. So it was a wonderful experience for the students. I must say that there was certainly some tragedy, sorrowful times, some conflict. I don't think you can go through 30 or 40 years of your life and not have it. I mentioned to you that I often took risks. So from the time I started here at Cheyenne, clear through the 20s into the early 30s, every summer I would take 2 weeks by myself and go into the mountains and spend that time by myself. I climbed as many mountains as I could. In 1920, I was down south climbing Mount Blanc. I was coming down and I fell 300 feet, but fortunately I didn't break anything. When we had the rodeo here, I tried to wrestle some steers and got banged up. I also got banged up one time trying to ride that glider. I got thrown off a horse a number of times. The most serious accident for me, though, was in a car accident just south here on Cheyenne Road when I was in the passenger side of a car and another one hit our car and shattered my hip. And from that time on, I had to use a cane. And at that time, I don't think we had the type of sophisticated medical work that you have today. Things were changing here. We were also going through, we finished the First World War. By that time, then, we got into the Depression. After that was over, coming to an end, it came to an end in part because the Second World War started. I remember this area right here where we had, the school was over here, the tennis courts here. During the Second World War, the students would bring in pieces of metal, anything they could find, and we had this scrap heap which was used for support of our military effort. But immediately after the Second World War, there was a great influx of people to this area. And a lot more building, more students coming here. And I realized that the times were changing, that we would have to build another school, and this would then, in some ways, get rid of the very setting that Dorothy and I appreciated for a school where everyone knew one another, where the faculty could work together. Also, I think there were a lot of social changes going on. Certainly the type of entertainment that people had was changing. All through the 20s and even in through the 30s, if you had to have entertainment, you created it yourself. You didn't turn on a radio. You didn't go watch television. Movies were coming in, but that was a once a week or once a month event. It wasn't an everyday thing. But this was changing. Also, the automobile was having an enormous effect upon this city. Before, all the buildings seemed to go wherever the trolley lines were. But now with cars, people were building wherever they wanted to build because you could drive to it. And so by the 1950, we decided that was our last year. And then in the graduation of the class of 1951, we had turned in our resignation and passed it on to others. I continued my work with the dancing, ran the workshops each summer. In the 1950s, I wrote a series of 184 newspaper columns for the Colorado Springs Free Press, which no longer exists, of course. But they were something of a record of how I look back upon this whole period. I also traveled quite a bit and was mainly involved with the dancing. But in 1957, I suffered a stroke. And then in 58, I had a more severe stroke, and that summer I died. But I look back And I had an exciting time, and also lived at an amazing time. And listening to some of you before we began this evening, you talk about the enormous change that's taking place in your time. But that change was also happening all through my life. Whether it was moving from a horse and buggy to a car, to trolley cars that suddenly had electricity, to in 1903 the Wright brothers flying an airplane, and then 50 to 60 years later, everyone is traveling by jet. I remember in high school, my father and I were going to Denver, and we were on the plateau between Palmer Lake and Castle Rock, and the train was probably going 50, 55 miles an hour, and my dad said, "Son, we may be going as fast as anyone has ever traveled." And that's true. And here today, you look up in the sky and we have people going around the world at 17,000 miles an hour. It's been an enormous time of change. But I look back and I'm proud of the littlest wise man, and that is still a source of enjoyment for a great number of people today, although ironically, not for you people here in Colorado Springs. I'm proud that we had an educational system and an experiment here at Cheyenne for a number of years that gave students an opportunity for a style that was quite different than other schools. It gave the faculty and the students an experience of the nature and the surroundings in these mountains that I don't think anyone else could achieve. I'm also proud that I had a part to play in the rejuvenation of dancing in this country, and that continues today with the Lloyd Shaw Foundation and with the workshops and programs that they put on. But I'm also proud that I was married to a wonderful woman who probably kept me balanced a number of times, maybe more times than I care to remember, who, after I died, went on to become a fine community person, a wonderful poet, who had a knack for language that far exceeded my own. And I wanted to read one piece to you that she wrote shortly after I died that not only captures something of her feelings about me, but also, I think, catches something that all of you have probably experienced just living in this area. She wrote this in the winter of 1958. Winter. Not deep and bitter yet, but she trails her long, cold, icicle-sharp fingers across the face of the land, lightly and certainly. I drive to Denver often, usually in the morning. The streams still run free and clear, but the little ponds are frozen and covered with snow. The sun is behind me, over my right shoulder. The range is ahead. The vast alabaster mass of Mount Evans against gunmetal sky gleams with silver highlights, and the zenith is stark blue. I like going alone, for when I come face to face with those great white mountains, Lloyd is there. His feet have walked those summits. His head has lain against the fragrant duff beneath those trees. He is part of them, and they are part of him, and the world is filled with leaping joy. This is a season of great sunsets, and all that has been lost from the dreaming world is poured and lifted into the sky in a great golden libation. I come home at sunset. Our peak is ahead, and the noble crags of Cheyenne Mountain, and the rosy clouds whirl up from the east in great banners and are flung across the summits. And there wind-blown snow is caught and colored into rainbows. And once again, the unbearable triumph of that soaring spirit, so near, so tender, and so unattainable. How does it feel, I ask him, to swoop over the mountain in a sunset? Oh, she had a wonderful way with language. And finally, I want to leave you with a few lines that are in the beginning of my book called Nature Notes of the Pikes Peak region. This is a book that I wrote in 1916. That summer, Dorothy and I lived at the top of Mount Manitou. And each day there would be tourists, especially that would come to the top, and then I would take them on tours and show them all the area and talk about the trees and the birds and the flowers and the geology. And after a couple of weeks, Dorothy said, "Why don't you start writing these things down?" So I began writing an article. Then I sent it into the